Chapter 1, Part 2 of Principia Ethica. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Fredrik Karlsson. Principia Ethica by G. E. Moore. 12. Suppose a man says, "I am pleased," and suppose it is not a lie or a mistake, but the truth. Well, if it is true, what does that mean? It means that his mind, a certain definite mind, distinguished by certain definite marks from all others, has at this moment a certain definite feeling called pleasure. Pleased means nothing but having pleasure, and though we may be more pleased or less pleased, and even, we may admit for the present, have one or another kind of pleasure, yet in so far as it is pleasure we have, whether there be more or less of it, and whether it be of one kind or another, what we have is one definite thing, absolutely indefinable, some one thing that is the same in all the various degrees and in all the various kinds of it that there may be. We may be able to say how it is related to other things, that, for example, it is in the mind, that it causes desire, that we are conscious of it, etc., etc. We can, I say, describe its relations to other things, but define it we cannot. And if anybody tried to define pleasure for us as being any other natural object, if anybody were to say, for instance, that pleasure means the sensation of red, and were to proceed to deduce from that pleasure is a color, we should be entitled to laugh at him and to distrust his future statements about pleasure. Well, that would be the same fallacy which I have called the naturalistic fallacy. That pleased does not mean having the sensation of red, or anything else whatever, does not prevent us from understanding what it does mean. It is enough for us to know that pleased does mean having the sensation of pleasure, and though pleasure is absolutely indefinable, though pleasure is pleasure and nothing else whatever, yet we feel no difficulty in saying that we are pleased. The reason is, of course, that when I say I am pleased, I do not mean that I am the same thing as having pleasure. And similarly, no difficulty need be found in my saying that pleasure is good, and yet not meaning that pleasure is the same thing as good, that pleasure means good, and that good means pleasure. If I were to imagine that when I said I am pleased, I meant that I was exactly the same thing as pleased, I should not indeed call that a naturalistic fallacy, although it would be the same fallacy as I have called naturalistic with reference to ethics. The reason of this is obvious enough. When a man confuses two natural objects with one another, defining the one by the other, if, for instance, he confuses himself, who is one natural object, with pleased or with pleasure, which are others, then there is no reason to call the fallacy naturalistic. But if he confuses good, which is not in the same sense a natural object, with any natural object whatever, then there is reason for calling that a naturalistic fallacy. Its being made with regard to good marks it as something quite specific, and the specific mistake deserves a name because it is so common. As for the reasons why good is not to be considered a natural object, they may be preserved for discussion in another place. But, for the present, it is sufficient to notice this. Even if it were a natural object, that would not alter the nature of the fallacy nor diminish its importance one whit. All that I have said about it would remain quite equally true. Only the name which I have called it would not be so appropriate as I think it is. And I do not care about the name. What I do care about is the fallacy. It does not matter what we call it, provided we recognize it when we meet it. It is to be met with in almost every book on ethics, and yet it is not recognized, and that is why it is necessary to multiply illustrations of it, and convenient to give it a name. It is a very simple fallacy indeed. When we say that an orange is yellow, we do not think our statement binds us to hold that orange means nothing else than yellow, or that nothing can be yellow but an orange. Supposing the orange is also sweet, does that bind us to say that sweet is exactly the same thing as yellow, that sweet must be defined as yellow? And supposing it be recognized that yellow just means yellow and nothing else whatever, does that make it any more difficult to hold that oranges are yellow? Most certainly it does not. On the contrary, it would be absolutely meaningless to say that oranges were yellow unless yellow did in the end mean just yellow and nothing else whatever, unless it was absolutely indefinable. We should not get very far with our science if we were bound to hold that everything which was yellow meant exactly the same thing as yellow. We should find we had to hold that an orange was exactly the same thing as a stool, a piece of paper, a lemon, anything you like. We could prove any number of absurdities, but should we be the nearer to the truth? Why then should it be different with good? Why, if good is good and indefinable, should I be held to deny that pleasure is good? Is there any difficulty in holding both to be true at once? On the contrary, there is no meaning in saying that pleasure is good, unless good is something different from pleasure. It is absolutely useless, so far as ethics is concerned, to prove, as Mr. Spencer tries to do, that increase of pleasure coincides with increase of life, unless good means something different from either life or pleasure. He might just as well try to prove that an orange is yellow by shewing that it is always wrapped up in paper. 13. In fact, if it is not the case that good denotes something simple and indefinable, only two alternatives are possible. Either it is a complex, a given whole, about the correct analysis of which there could be disagreement, or else it means nothing at all and there is no such subject as ethics. In general, however, ethical philosophers have attempted to define good without recognizing what such an attempt must mean. They actually use arguments which involve one or both of the absurdities considered in section 11. We are, therefore, justified in concluding that the attempt to define good is chiefly due to want of clearness as to the possible nature of definition. There are, in fact, only two serious alternatives to be considered in order to establish the conclusion that good does denote a simple and indefinable notion. It might possibly denote a complex, as horse does, or it might have no meaning at all. Neither of these possibilities has, however, been clearly conceived and seriously maintained as such by those who presume to define good, and both may be dismissed by a simple appeal to facts. 1. The hypothesis that disagreement about the meaning of good is disagreement with regard to the correct analysis of a given whole may be most plainly seen to be incorrect by consideration of the fact that, whatever definition may be offered, it may always be asked, with significance, of the complex so defined, whether it is itself good. To take, for instance, one of the more plausible because one of the more complicated of such proposed definitions, it may easily be thought at first sight that to be good may mean to be that which we desire to desire. Thus, if we apply this definition to a particular instance and say, when we think that A is good, we are thinking that A is one of the things which we desire to desire, our proposition may seem quite plausible. But if we carry the investigation further and ask ourselves, is it good to desire A? It is apparent on a little reflection that this question is itself as intelligible as the original question, is A good? That we are, in fact, now asking for exactly the same information about the desire to desire A for which we formerly asked with regard to A itself. But it is also apparent that the meaning of this second question cannot be correctly analyzed into, is the desire to desire A one of the things which we desire to desire? We have not before our minds anything so complicated as the question, do we desire to desire to desire to desire A? Moreover, any one can easily convince himself by inspection that the predicate of this proposition, good, is positively different from notion of desiring to desire, which enters into its subject. That we should desire to desire A is good is not merely equivalent to that A should be good is good. It may indeed be true that what we desire to desire is always good. Perhaps even the converse may be true. But it is very doubtful whether this is the case, and the mere fact that we understand very well what is meant by doubting it shews clearly that we have two different notions before our mind. 2. And the same consideration is sufficient to dismiss the hypothesis that good has no meaning whatsoever. It is very natural to make the mistake of supposing that what is universally true is of such a nature that its negation would be self-contradictory. The importance which has been assigned to analytic propositions in the history of philosophy shews how easy such a mistake is. And thus it is very easy to conclude that what seems to be a universal ethical principle is in fact an identical proposition. That if, for example, whatever is called good seems to be pleasant, the proposition pleasure is the good does not assert a connection between two different notions, but involves only one, that of pleasure, which is easily recognized as a distinct entity. But whoever will attentively consider with himself what is actually before his mind when he asks the question, is pleasure, or whatever it may be, after all good, can easily satisfy himself that he is not merely wondering whether pleasure is pleasant. And if he will try this experiment with each suggested definition in succession, he may become expert enough to recognize that in every case he has before his mind a unique object, with regard to the connection of which with any other object a distinct question may be asked. Every one does in fact understand the question, is this good? When he thinks of it, his state of mind is different from what it would be were he asked, is this pleasant, or desired, or approved? It has a distinct meaning for him, even though he may not recognize in what respect it is distinct. Whenever he thinks of intrinsic value, or intrinsic worth, or says that a thing ought to exist, he has before his mind the unique object, the unique property of things, that I mean by good. Everybody is constantly aware of this notion, although he may never become aware at all that it is different from other notions of which he is also aware. But for correct ethical reasoning it is extremely important that he could become aware of this fact, and as soon as the nature of the problem is closely understood there should be little difficulty in advancing so far in analysis. 14. Good, then, is indefinable, and yet, so far as I know, there is only one ethical writer, Professor Henry Sidgwick, who has clearly recognized and stated this fact. We shall see indeed how far many of the most reputed ethical systems fall short of drawing the conclusions which follow from such a recognition. At present I will only quote from one instance which will serve to illustrate the meaning and importance of this principle that good is indefinable, or, as Professor Sidgwick says, an unanalyzable notion. It is an instance to which Professor Sidgwick himself refers in a note on the passage in which he argues that ought is unanalyzable. Bentham, says Sidgwick, explains that his fundamental principle states the greatest happiness of all those whose interest is in question as being the right and proper end of proper action. And yet, his language in other passages of the same chapter would seem to imply that he means by the word right conducive to the general happiness. Professor Sidgwick sees that, if you take these two statements together, you get the absurd result that greatest happiness is the end of human action, which is conducive to the general happiness. And so absurd does it seem to him to call this result, as Bentham calls it, the fundamental principle of a moral system, that he suggests that Bentham cannot have meant it. Yet Professor Sidgwick himself states elsewhere that psychological hedonism is not seldom confounded with egoistic hedonism, and that confusion, as we shall see, rests chiefly on the same fallacy, the naturalistic fallacy, which is implied in Bentham's statements. Professor Sidgwick admits therefore that this fallacy is sometimes committed, absurd as it is, and I am inclined to think that Bentham may really have been one of those who committed it. Mill, as we shall see, certainly did commit it. In any case, whether Bentham committed it or not, his doctrine, as above quoted, will serve as a very good illustration of this fallacy, and of the importance of the contrary proposition that good is indefinable. Let us consider this doctrine. Bentham seems to imply, so Professor